ALD, Issue 7, Text 1. Op-ed, which means opinion, editorial. Op-ed. So when you see that, you're going to get somebody's opinion. Telling Americans to Vote, or Else, by William A. Galston. Jury duty is mandatory. Do you know what jury duty is? When you have to serve on a jury of 12 people for a criminal case. Those of us who are voting citizens get jury duty summons pretty much every year. So jury duty is mandatory, and if you don't respond to it, you could be arrested. So it is mandatory. Jury duty is mandatory. Why not voting? The idea seems vaguely un-American. Maybe so, but it's neither unusual nor undemocratic. And it would ease the intense partisan polarization that weakens our capacity for self-government and public trust in our governing institutions. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second. Polarizing. So you think about the Earth, North Pole, South Pole. So we have the Republicans and the Democrats, and they're always fighting. Democrats say the Republicans are terrible. Republicans say the Democrats are terrible. We call that polarizing. They're on opposite ends. So it's polarizing and it's partisan, the two different parties, Democrats and Republicans. Okay? It would ease the intense partisan polarization that weakens our capacity for self-government, and especially the public trust part, because most people are pretty much fed up with Republicans and Democrats. And we don't trust our leaders, right? Public trust. Okay, so let's read through that again. Jury duty is mandatory. Why not voting? The idea seems vaguely un-American. Maybe so, but it's neither unusual nor undemocratic. And it would ease the intense partisan polarization that weakens our capacity for self-government and public trust in our governing institutions. 31 countries have some form of mandatory voting, according to the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. The list, 31 countries, the list includes 9 members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and 2/3 of the Latin American nations. More than half back up the legal requirement with an enforcement mechanism, while the rest are content to rely on the moral force of the law. Okay, so enforcement mechanism, some sort of consequence or punishment if they do not vote. And moral force of the law is do the right thing. We're not going to punish you, but you should do the right thing. That's the moral force of the law. Despite the prevalence, how frequently we see it, prevalence, despite the prevalence of mandatory voting in so many democracies, it's easy to dismiss the practice as a form of statism. Statism such as, what are we talking about? We're talking about dictatorships. We're talking about Stalin, right? Lenin, Hitler, Mussolini. Okay, statism. Let's go back to the beginning of the sentence. Despite the prevalence of mandatory voting in so many democracies, it's easy to dismiss the practice as a form of statism that couldn't work in America's individualistic and libertarian political culture. Now, there's some big words here. Individual, you know what that means. Our culture is individualistic. We believe in the power and the rights of the individual. That you should be able to do what you want to do. And if you don't want to vote, oh well. Libertarian, you know the word liberty. Libertarian is on a political spectrum where the only laws that should be applied to people are just the basic bare laws. Like don't kill, right? Don't steal. But everything else should be up to the individual person. So individualistic libertarian. So let's read that sentence one more time. Big words. Despite the prevalence of mandatory voting in so many democracies, it's easy to dismiss the practice as a form of statism that couldn't work in America's individualistic and libertarian political culture. But consider Australia. Okay, actually, we're going to pause there. And I would like for you to read this first bit with a partner, practicing a close read with a teacher and a student, leaving out key words. Okay, so we're on page 108, the first text of issue 7. And the sentence said, but consider Australia, whose political culture is closer to that of the United States than any other English-speaking country. Alarmed by a decline in voter turnout to less than 60% in 1922, Australia adopted mandatory voting in 1924, backed by the small fines, roughly the size of a traffic ticket, right? So they charge money if you don't vote. Backed by the small fines, roughly the size of a traffic ticket, for non-voting, rising with repeated acts of non-participation. So the more you don't vote, the more money you owe. Okay. The law established permissible, say that word, permissible, allowable. The law established permissible, like the word permission, permissible. The law established permissible reasons for not voting, like illness. So if you're sick, that's okay. Foreign travel. If you're not in the country, that's okay. And allows citizens who faced fines for not voting to defend themselves. So you can go to court and defend yourself. The results were remarkable. So good results or bad results? Positive, right? In the 1925 election, the first held under the new law, voter turnout soared. So soared means went up a lot. So we got soared, remarkable, both positive words. It soared to 91% voter turnout. That is amazing. In recent elections, it has hovered, stayed about 95%. So in Australia, which is very similar to the United States in many ways, they have 95% voter turnout. And what's our voter turnout? According to data file, it was 56. Okay. The law also changed civic norms, like what's normal in the city, what's normal in the civilization. Australians are more likely than before to see voting as an obligation, something they're supposed to do, they should do. Of course, the negative side effects many feared did not materialize. Read that sentence with me. The negative side effects many feared did not materialize. They didn't become real, materialize. For example, the percentage of ballots intentionally spoiled or completed randomly as acts of resistance remained on the order of 2 to 3%. In other words, people didn't intentionally spill juice on their ballots to rebel. Very few people did things like that. Proponents, and proponents means they're for it, right? Proponents offer 3 reasons in favor of mandatory voting. The first is straightforwardly civic. Straightforwardly civic. Civic means having to do with citizenship, right? A democracy can't be strong if its citizenship is weak. And right now, American citizenship is attenuated. Say that word? Attenuated. It's strong on rights, but it is weak on responsibilities. We all say, oh, we have the right to do this. Oh, but we don't want to do anything. We don't want responsibilities. Okay? So strong on rights, weak on responsibilities. That is the first reason mandatory voting is favored by the proponents. There is less and less that being a citizen requires of us, especially after the abolition of the draft. That's when 18-year-old men could have their names picked to fight in wars. So that's been abolished. We don't have a draft right now. Okay? So what do we need to do as citizens? There's almost nothing required of us. Requiring people to vote in national elections once every 2 years would reinforce the principle of reciprocity at the heart of citizenship. Let's read that sentence again. Requiring people to vote in national elections once every 2 years would reinforce the principle of reciprocity at the heart of citizenship. And what is reciprocity? Reciprocity is, I'll do this for you, and you'll do this for me. Reciprocity. The second argument for mandatory voting is democratic. Ideally, a democracy would take into account the interests and views of all citizens. But if some regularly vote while others don't, officials, the rulers, right, the officials, are likely to give greater weight to participants. This might not matter much if non-participants were evenly distributed through the population, but political scientists have long known that they aren't evenly distributed. People with lower levels of income, so less money, and lower levels of education, less education, are less likely to vote. You understand that? So people who are poorer and undereducated are less likely to vote. As are young adults and recent first-generation immigrants. So, in other words, those people also need to have a voice, so they should be voting. Changes in our political system have magnified, made great, these disparities. Lots of big words in this article. Disparity means differences. Read the sentence with me. Changes in our political system have magnified these disparities. One more time. Changes in our political system have magnified these disparities. Disparities means differences or inequalities. During the 1950s and 60s, when turnout rates were much higher, political parties reached out to citizens year-round. At the local level, these parties, which reformers often criticized as machines, connected even citizens of modest means and limited education with neighborhood institutions, and gave them a sense of participation in national politics as well. Okay, that's a long sentence. Come on now. So we're saying that back 50, 60 years ago, okay, when more voters were coming to vote, political parties reached out to local groups, okay, and so there was more participation. Okay, in its heyday means at the highest level of participation, like when it was most popular. In its heyday, organized labor reinforced these effects. So teachers' unions, welders' unions, other organized labor, farmers' unions. In its heyday, organized labor reinforced these effects. But in the absence of these more organic forms of political mobilization, the second best option is a top-down mechanism of universal mobilization. Let's read that sentence. What does mobilization mean? So mobile means to get something moving, right? So political mobilization means getting people active, getting them involved in doing something. Okay, let's read that sentence again. Lots of big words. And I'm seeing lots of SAT words in this. But in the absence of these more organic forms of political mobilization, the second best option is a top-down mechanism of universal mobilization. So everybody's moving. Universal. Top-down, meaning it's a law. The boss says you have to do it. Okay. Mandatory voting. Am I in the right place? Mandatory voting would tend to even out disparities stemming from income, education, and age, enhancing our system's inclusiveness. Okay, again, disparities means inequalities or differences. And there are differences because of money, education, age. So let's read this again. Read it with me. Mandatory voting would tend to even out disparities stemming from income, education, and age, enhancing our system's inclusiveness. It is true, as some object, that an enforcement mechanism would impose greater burdens on those with fewer resources. So in other words, if you're poor and you're going to get fined money for not voting, that's hardly fair. So greater burden for those who have fewer resources. But this makes it all the more likely that these citizens would respond by going to the polls and voting. And they would stand to gain far more than the cost of a traffic ticket. They would gain having their voice heard, right? So the third argument for mandatory voting goes to the heart of our current ills, our current problems, our woes, our sicknesses. Our low turnout rate pushes American politics toward increased polarization. Remember that? Polarization. The reason is that hardcore partisans are more likely to dominate lower turnout elections, while those who are less fervent, who are more in the middle, who are more balanced in their views, they're less likely to, get elected, get attention. Only the ones like Trump, who say crazy things, or like Hillary, who's got all this scandal around her, only those people get attention. Okay, let me get rid of my scribbles. Scribbles here, scribbles there. So the reason is that hardcore partisans are more likely to dominate lower turnout elections, while those who are less fervent, to go to the next page, those who are less fervent, while those who are less fervent about specific issues and less attached to political organizations tend not to participate at levels proportional to their share of the electorate. Big words. A distinctive feature of our constitutional system, elections that are quadrennial, so quad means 4, rennial means years, so 4 years. Elections that are every 4 years for president, but biennial, every 2 years, for the House of Representatives. Okay. A distinctive feature of our constitutional system magnifies these effects. It's bad enough that only 3/5 of the electorate turns out to determine the next president, but much worse that only 2/5, so 40%, of our citizens vote in House elections 2 years later. If events combine to energize one part of the political spectrum and dishearten the other, a relatively small portion of the electoral electorate can shift the system out of all proportion to its numbers. In other words, when the Republicans have a big victory, the Democrats are very, very sad. And when the Democrats have a big victory, then the Republicans are very, very sad. And it can change the balance of powers. It says, out of all proportion to its numbers. And you'll learn more about that in your government class in 12th grade. Okay. Some observers are comfortable with this asymmetry, imbalance, unevenness. Everyone say asymmetry. Another SAT word. But if you think that today's intensely polarized politics impedes governance and exacerbates mistrust, and that is what most Americans firmly, and in my view rightly, believe, then you should be willing to consider reforms that would strengthen the forces of conciliation. We're going to have to read that sentence again. Yes, we will. Okay, lots of SAT words. Let's get these on your mouth, on your tongue. But, read with me. But if you think that today's intensely polarized politics impedes governance and exacerbates mistrust, and that is what most Americans firmly, and in my view rightly, believe, then you should be willing to consider reforms that would strengthen the forces of conciliation. You should say, yes, we should have reforms that would make us all get together on the same page. Conciliation. Imagine our politics with laws and civic norms that yield near universal voting. Campaigns, election campaigns, could devote far less money to costly, labor-intensive, get out the vote efforts. Media gurus wouldn't have the same incentive to drive down turnout with negative advertising. Candidates would know that they must do more than mobilize their bases with red meat rhetoric on hot button issues. Such language. Such a system would improve not only electoral politics, but also the legislative process. Rather than focusing on, what's that word? Symbolic. Rather than focusing on symbolic gestures whose major purpose is to agitate partisans. So we're just trying to aggravate people, agitate partisans, Republicans or Democrats. Congress might actually roll up its sleeves and tackle the serious, complex issues it ignores. In other words, if it wasn't for all the fighting, maybe they would actually accomplish something in Congress and do the work they're supposed to do. The United States is not Australia, of course, and there's no guarantee that the similarity of our political cultures would produce equivalent political results. Equivalent meaning the same. Let's read that sentence together. The United States is not Australia, of course, and there's no guarantee that the similarity of our political cultures would produce equivalent political results. For example, reforms of general elections would leave untouched the distortions generated by party primaries, in which small numbers of voters can shape the choices for the entire electorate. And the United States Constitution gives the states enormous power over voting procedures. Mandatory voting nationwide would go counter to our traditions and perhaps our Constitution. The separation of power between the states and the country, the national part of the country, the federal part of the country. So for the feds to tell the states, you have to do this, that's what we had a civil war over before, right? We don't like it when the feds tell the states what to do. Okay, so mandatory voting nationwide would go counter against our traditions and would encounter strong state opposition. Instead, a half dozen states from parts of the country with different civic traditions should experiment with the practices and observers. With the practice and observers, journalists, social scientists, citizens groups, and elected officials would monitor the consequences. So he's saying, give it a try and we'll let you know how it's going. We journalists, we'll tell you. We don't know what the outcome would be. But one thing is clear, if we do nothing and allow a politics of passion to define the bounds of the electorate, as it has for much of the last 4 decades, the prospect for a less polarized, more effective political system that enjoys the trust and confidence of the people is not bright. He's saying the future, where is it? Do nothing, this prospect is not bright. So he's saying, if we don't do anything, everything's going downhill. Okay, let's read with a partner. Hello, we are looking at ALD, Issue 7, Text 2, which is a speech. And I Googled and I could not find the audio for this speech so that you could hear Lee Hamilton speak with his own voice. I found pictures of him and information about him. He is not just Lee H. Hamilton, he is the Honorable Lee H. Hamilton. He's a judge, and he's won many awards in his life. The speech itself is several places online, but I couldn't find the audio, so you're stuck with me. Sorry. What does it mean to be an American citizen? And we will be doing this as a close read, so I will be leaving blanks, and you will be filling them in. What does it mean to be an American citizen? By Lee H. Hamilton. We are here today because the success of any democracy is determined by the participation of its citizens. Let's read it again. Together. We are here today because the success of any democracy is determined by the participation of its citizens. Lincoln asked whether a nation devoted to the values of liberty, equality, justice, and opportunity, quote, so conceived, can long endure. In other words, he said, Can such a country last? Can it endure? In these words, he told us a truth about our democracy, that its survival is never guaranteed, and that its success demands wisdom, action, and even, what's that word? Vigilance. A careful watch, vigilance, and even vigilance from American citizens. Thus, I focus my remarks today on the basic question: what does it mean to be an American citizen? We're going to pause here, and I'd like you to practice reading the first 2 paragraphs as if you were giving the speech. Practice with a partner, please. Section 1. What do we owe? First, what do we as American citizens owe? So, what do we as American citizens owe? We begin with gratitude. As many have said, the joy of being an American is the joy of freedom and opportunity. We have been bequeathed freedom. Bequeathed means given. Read it with me. We have been bequeathed freedom, justice, and opportunity from the deeds and commitments, even the spilled blood of Americans who came before us. We did not earn the inheritance. We did not earn the inheritance. This nation of unequaled wealth and power, of freedom and opportunity was given to us. But no matter how rich and powerful it becomes, America is not and never will be a finished project. It is always a borning. You know the word born? So it's always being born. It's always growing. It is always a borning. That looks like an SAT word. You and I are handed a work in progress, one that can evolve for good or for ill. Now, ill means sick, but in this sentence, good or not good, right? Can evolve for good or for bad, for evil. American democracy makes a wager, a bet, on its citizens. The deal is simple. With freedom comes, say it again, with freedom comes obligation. With liberty comes duty. If that deal is not kept, democracy is threatened. Lincoln said at Gettysburg, "It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced." He spoke of a new birth of freedom, so that government of, by, and for the people would not perish, means die, would not die. So read that sentence with me. He spoke of a new birth of freedom, so that government of, by, and for the people would not perish. You and I must learn, and we must teach our young the words we live by: the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the other grand documents of American history. And we must learn and teach about the institutions that bring life and permanence, things lasting over time, permanence, to these words and deeds so familiar to us, so that they may fulfill Lincoln's charge. Democracy is not fixed like a monarchy. Fixed means it doesn't change, stays the same. So democracy is not staying the same like a monarchy. It is dynamic. It changes. Democracy reflects the will and, above all, the action of each generation of American citizens. So what do we owe? As Americans, we owe a profound debt of gratitude for the actions of those who preceded us. And we owe those who will follow an America that is even greater and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. ALD Issue 7, Voting and Citizenship, Text 3. Text 3 is a novel excerpt, meaning this is not an article. This is a smaller sample, a smaller piece from a large work of fiction, a novel. The light that shined from Ruleville, like a city where everything's rules. The Light That Shined from Ruleville, from the novel Countdown by Deborah Wiles. Fannie Lou Townsend Hamer was child number 20. She had 14 older brothers and 5 older sisters, so she was the baby, born on a farm in the hill country of Mississippi in 1917, the same year as JFK, more than 50 years after the end of the Civil War. So Fannie Lou, a black child, was born into freedom. Or was she? Her parents were sharecroppers on the farm. The whole family took care of one another and worked from daybreak to dusk to bring in the cotton harvest for the plantation owner. When Fannie was a baby, one of her brothers accidentally dropped her, and the fall broke her leg. There was no money for a doctor, so the bone wasn't set properly, and Fannie Lou walked with a limp for the rest of her days. When she was 2 years old, her family moved to Sunflower County, to another plantation, this one in the rich soil of the Mississippi Delta, where Fannie Lou grew up and lived for the rest of her life. Ruleville was the name of the town. The Delta land was as flat as a door, as far as the eye could see. Every now and then, a tree grew in the middle of a field, like a scarecrow with 8 or 10 limbs, like arms akimbo. Hanging trees, the sharecropper families called them. Like other sharecropper families living and working on plantations, Fannie Lou's family was paid to bring in the cotton, but they weren't paid much, and they weren't paid fairly. They did all the work, but stayed poor. And in the Delta, there were no other jobs. Most Negroes knew they were being cheated. but they rarely said anything when it came time for payday. It was too dangerous. White people owned the Delta, owned Mississippi, and owned the American South. They made the rules, and they depended on their cheap labor, the black sharecroppers, to make them their fortunes. There were poor white families, too. It had been that way ever since the days of slavery, and most white people in Mississippi wanted it to stay that way. They didn't want the Negroes to have any power. What were they afraid of? So they made rules. Some were written into law, some were unspoken. And the Negroes, who wanted to keep themselves and their families safe, learned to obey these rules. Negroes were second-class citizens. They couldn't go to the same good schools as white children, couldn't eat in the same restaurants, couldn't swim in the town pools or shop in the same stores or use the same bathrooms. They could cook and clean and sew and take care of white folks. And that's what many of them did, those who didn't work on the plantations in the fields. Most of them were not registered to vote. They knew that asking for change was dangerous. Pushing for fairness had found many a black man hanging by his neck from a hanging tree, out in the middle of the Delta, or scraping the bottom of a riverbed nearby. So there was no money for shoes. In the summer, Fannie Lou went barefoot. In the winter, her mother tied rags around Fannie Lou's feet to keep them warm. But Fannie got so cold, she would stand in the places where the cows had been resting in order to warm her feet.